Retail CongresShop.
My name is Brian Catron, and I'm with APL Logistics, and I was invited to talk about the trends that we see in global supply chains specifically for retailers around the world. One thing for sure with the retail industry and the supply chains that I want to touch on here is simply the influence that the general consumer, the individual consumer, has on the retail industry. They're empowered to they're empowered to influence the decisions made by retailers like no other time in history. The retailers are looking for the individual consumer's interest. It's slowly becoming, or not slowly now, it's very quickly becoming a demand and pull consumerism rather than the push and supply model that we've had in past decades. So I'm going to touch upon a couple trends that we see in the retail industry. Many of those we're already talking about today, and just then translate those into a supply chain and logistics implication. First of all, the digitalization of everything, basically. Everything is digital today. As we've already talked about, people are buying with their phones, online. Nothing new here. I'm not giving any major trade secrets. That's just the world that we live in today. But what that means, though, from a consumer and retail perspective is that the consumer or the customer is no longer required to go into a store, pull a shirt or a product off the shelf, feel it, smell it, try it on, and then go to a cash register, interact with the cashier, pull out their wallet with hard currency, take the product and walk out the door. Today, as you know, many of the exchanges are online. They're purchasing a virtual electronic product that's sitting on the screen. It's not even real, but they like it. They want to buy it. They know it's going to become something that they own eventually. They're paying with currency that's electronic. They don't even have it. It's sitting in a virtual account. They hope they have enough to pay for the product. And so that experience is now translating into this supply chain environment also, because at the same time, they're looking to have that product as quickly as they would have it if they were at the store. So that's where it starts to add some complication into the supply chain environment. Also the omni-channel, again, no secrets here. We all live in this omni-channel environment. And from a supply chain perspective, that certainly means that an example would be that a customer would like to order product online on their phone, hopefully during their lunch hour, not during the day. And then they will swing by a locker or a depot, pick up that product on their way home. So that when they get home, they can try it on, see if they like it when they look in the mirror in their own dressing room. And then the next day, they'll drive back, possibly by one of the stores that would be selling it, if it's a brick and mortar store, and maybe they purchased 3 items. One of those items they're going to drop off at the store as a return and then head back to work. So it's open storefronts at all hours of the day, at any point in which I as a consumer would like to have that exchange. And of course that creates its own challenges. And if a consumer or a retailer doesn't want to accommodate that, certainly there will be another consumer or another retailer who will accommodate that requirement from that customer. And that brings up the next subject, which is value. There's just an endless number of competitors in the retail industry. Unless you have a retailer, unless the retailer has a very unique product for their storefront, whether it's online or a brick and mortar storefront, it's very likely that there are a dozen other retailer or locations or exchange places in which that product can be sold. So the competition is just incredible. And then the last piece here, while retailers are trying to balance all these dynamics around the new electronic environment, the new demands for the customers that continue to grow, now the customer wants to be treated as the one individual. So they can't accumulate all these ideas. You can take all the data and try to put it and deploy it to your strategy, your market strategy. But that customer wants their product at their location, at their price, and they want to have that experience. So of course, all of you as retailers are trying to adapt to that environment. And then from our perspective, from a supply chain logistics provider, we need to translate those demands or those conditions into a successful market strategy or a transportation logistics strategy for you. One of those aspects is certainly the fact that you need to have a dynamic inventory. So with all these channels of selling product, that means that you need to segment those channels and treat them uniquely, because they are, if you treat them all as one channel, you're going to fail in all the other channels. However, as we move to the next piece here, the integrated technology, you will want to segment those channels, but you can't segment or separate the inventory. You need to have the inventory across all sales channels, but then create the sales channel unique for the customer still. One other piece here I missed on the dynamic inventory on the side here is certainly the need to have multiple distribution points. Certainly in the United States, and I didn't jump into this for the local market here, but certainly in the United States, people are starting to distribute from the stores, as I think many of you have heard, because they can't access the customer quickly enough from the distribution points that would traditionally come from the distribution center. So now there's a need to have multiple regional, localized distribution points to get quickly to the customer so they can purchase that virtual product they bought online and still receive the gratification of having that product almost as quickly as if they bought it over the counter. And then, of course, here with the unique requirements of the customer, the speed to market concept, I'll touch on that here in just a second, and certainly regional preferences. You can imagine even the soccer uniforms or outfits or practice gear for football here in Chile would be different than what would be in Colombia. And as we were even talking with my colleague last night, the jerseys that you might want to buy in the mountain region versus the coastal regions will be different. And so that's the type of adaptation that the retailers must take in consideration when they launch product into certain markets, what's going to sell. But again, you have to look at that inventory across the entire spectrum of each one of those channels. One last thing I want to touch here, and I'll get into this a little bit more as I go into my presentation, is certainly the reverse logistics is a whole nother dynamic of that returns management. And then, of course, sustainability, which we have some people talking about that here today, is a growing demand on retailers. And then that has implications for the logistics industry. So across our entire account base, and when we survey customers outside of our direct control, one common theme across the entire industry that we're seeing is life cycle compression. And traditionally what that meant was try and just shrink your lead time, go to your transportation provider, use a faster vessel, maybe you air freight it. But that is not really the focus of full product life cycle compression. This is taking information from previous sales, your sales through data, understanding the market, then using that and going into your concept, design, and then eventually working into your production and then moving to market. It's compressing all this activity so that you can get ideas to the market more quickly. Now, there's been you could blame this on the Amazon effect, where they say they will deliver within an hour, or you could say Zara with their fast fashion. But whatever the case is, we are seeing this across the entire industry, whether it's a fast fashion retailer or it's a mass merchant that sells discount goods. Everybody is looking to find some way to compress that lead time. So we did our own research just along our account base to say, what type of lead time are you looking at, and what are we trying to get to? And we looked at a standard, and if we took a kind of an average across a few of our customers, they had about a 221-day view of this life cycle from basically bill of goods, bulk fabric purchase, as well as the approvals of buttons, zippers, the samples going back and forth, that whole process that occurs in the design and product launch pre-manufacturing. And then moving into the manufacturing piece, that was an additional 77 days. So basically it's 116 for that pre-manufacturing activity, raw material management, then the 77 days for the factory production, and then 28 days in this transportation. And what this really shows us that is important to see, I think I've got a cue here, don't I? Oh, sorry. That's not what I thought. Sorry, I thought I had a little pointer. But anyway, what you can see is 221 days is the standard for this. But then we want to get into what's considered a rapid response, kind of the fast fashion concept, but it doesn't have to be necessarily fashion. And that's a reduction down from 221 days down to 114 days. And the method of doing that, as you can see, is not at the tail end over here on the blue part of the slide of the graph. Compressing a transportation is not going to get you very far. Certainly the last mile is important. The last moments of exchange are very, very important to that consumer. But for the life cycle of the entire product, to compress that, it has to move upstream much further, even before production. It's the concept to product creation that is the area that is the area of focus today. So I took some market data I was able to steal from my partner Gartner, which everyone probably is familiar with Gartner. And they did an assessment of what are some initiatives that retailers are taking to compress the lead time. And so let's just look at the top two that stand out. And the first one is improving internal process alignment, okay? And then the next one is more tightly integrating product development, planning, and supply chain applications. So just focusing on those two, these are really internal activities. These are, for example, one of our customers was talking about tearing down the silos or the departmental walls that exist and bringing those groups together. So instead of having supply chain, and I've seen this in many companies, often a separate company or a separate building because they've outgrown the corporate headquarters, they're bringing these people back in. Instead of having product category management sitting somewhere else and possibly even too far away from sourcing, they're trying to bring sourcing, product management, or category management and supply chain together, and also keeping technology within arm's length so they can start to share ideas more effectively, and that is the pre-production activity compression that's required. That's the feedback that Gartner got back from a number of retailers of where they were focusing their initiatives, is activities that are really internal with communication and dialogue across departments. Now, an idea that we were proposing and now are hearing quite a bit about from our customers is to introduce a raw material management program, a formal program. Now, many of you are probably already involved in managing raw materials with your suppliers into your final manufacturing point. But the question is, how strategic is it and how broad across your product base does it go? For a raw material management program, and this is what I was talking about, the buttons, the zippers approvals, the cuffs, the fabrics, the dyes, those activities, getting that aligned so that you can compress that lead time is certainly the primary focus for a raw material management program. But with a raw material management program, there come other benefits, and there could be other focus areas for that type of program. And one certainly is to be a socially responsible retailer. And as we touched on one of these groups, I think a couple of times, and we'll probably have more discussions on it later, the socially responsible retailer is an advantage because the consumer today wants to know that the company that they're buying the product from is not reckless in their pursuit to sell a product, meaning that they're not spoiling the environment, they're not at risk for toxicity in products that I'm buying. So that is an important piece to a raw material management program, independent of the compression. Certainly that allows you to have product quality, and then the other traditional areas, which are capital carrying cost, planing and visibility, and upstream accumulation. Those come along with the formal raw material management program, but the primary driver today is really because people are trying to compress the lead time of the product life cycle. Now, some methods or some strategies to introduce a raw material management program, and again, I bet many of you are already doing some of these to some extent, is first step would be to get into the procurement and financing of the raw materials. So if you have a final product, depending on whether you're a garment manufacturer or an electronics, or garment retailer or electronics retailer or various other products that could be sold, there's a need to control and understand the product right before final manufacturing. And so some manufacturers, especially in the garment industry, aren't very large, and so they may have cash flow issues that could interrupt your supply chain. Or it simply is an opportunity for you to secure the exact product that you're looking for. And this gets back to quality, because if left to a final finished goods manufacturer, at times they might substitute what they feel they can put into the end product, and it may not be to your quality specs. It may not be to the timeliness that you're looking for also. So certainly procurement and financing of the raw materials, and again, that gets back, if I'm using garments as my example, that gets back to the buttons, the zippers, the thread count, things like that. And then pre-positioning, the next step, pre-positioning those products nearby the manufacturing facility. That's a common theme with automotive manufacturing. They try to have their suppliers, at least in the United States, they try to have their suppliers, let's say about 100 kilometers to 200 kilometers within that zone. Not too close that they compete for labor, but not too far that they can't get the product there quickly enough for that finished manufacturing of that automobile. So within the retail industry, getting into the raw materials of our general retail products, that's the opportunity, is to position those materials so that you can secure capacity at the time of need for a strategic product launch. It may not be all your products. It's for specific products, and it's probably for core materials. If I could give an example, I think you may have seen in the news recently that Target stores and a number of other large retailers buy their bed linens from one major supplier in India who was selling Egyptian cotton bed sheets. And anyone that's familiar with cotton, is Egyptian cotton is considered really the finest in the world. Well, as they looked at all the bed sheets in the market that say they're Egyptian cotton, there's not enough Egyptian cotton in the world to supply for all those bed sheets. So someone started thinking, let's look into this raw material and see if it's truly Egyptian cotton. And as they found out, this supplier from India, who supplies many of the large retailers in the United States and around the world, was in fact selling cotton that was not Egyptian cotton. So they've all canceled their orders, they pulled it off the shelves, and now that I'm sure that supplier's very close to its existence is in question at this point. But the problem is that tarnishes the brand, certainly from the retailer's perspective. So anyway, these are all attributes to shrinking lead time, is having a formal raw material management program, financing the goods, pre-positioning the goods, platforming, I'll touch on here in a second. Let me just jump into platforming. If you're not familiar with platforming, which I think most people are, it's just standardizing certain products that will eventually be part of a finished product. In this case, it was t-shirts. You may have t-shirts that are going to be part of a portfolio of products that are 3 unrelated groups, and they all are launching a t-shirt without talking to each other because it's not a core product maybe that they are launching. And one happens to have a design that comes in using 140 gram weight t-shirt cotton. The next one has 150 gram t-shirt cotton, and the other one has 160, probably for no reason that they were looking for 160 gram t-shirt weight. They just wanted a t-shirt. But by bringing these groups together and collaborating, they can recognize that we should all have the same weight t-shirt, and then we can use that purchase and consolidate it together, our needs, consolidate the purchase, and get a more cost-effective raw material in the cotton rolls. And certainly, then the other part of the graph here is decrease complexity. So through this effort, we're seeing through this research here through BCG, is that the complexity of the raw materials that feeds final product can be reduced by 83%, which you can imagine has a big impact. It's a pretty large decrease in complexity. Let me go back up to this one, again on the raw material program. The procurement, the pre-positioning, the platforming strategies of standardization of products that can be used commonly across to help speed up the timeline. Provenance, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, which the example of the Target stores, Egyptian cotton would be an example of how far back do I need to go to verify that my end product is truly what I think it is, and it's safe, and it's a sustainable product. And then the last step here is certainly technology. One of the trends that we see on the technology front is the introduction of these product lifecycle management softwares. And there's a number of them out there. Some of the large ones over here, the Oracle and SAPs that we're familiar with. But then there's a lot of startups and a lot of new niche players that are stepping into the product lifecycle area. The important step with introducing a product lifecycle management tool is in the integration of that with your supply chain activities. Because buying another tool for product lifecycle management, if you don't already have one, or using one of the larger ones that is more of an enterprise-wide solution, might miss some of the details. And so grabbing a separate tool for product lifecycle management is a trend that we see. But then the next trend is trying to integrate that deeply with the supply chain tools so that you can speed, again, this gets back to lead time compression, you can speed up the process of product generation, concept and design, all the way to market with that final product. Okay, moving away from lead time compression, that was really a lot of time I wanted to point out, but it is a common theme we see across the entire industry, and I'd recommend looking into any of these various ideas here to see how some of these ideas can be implemented to reduce that lead time for your product launch. Now, jumping into the e-retail environment, again, information that we all know here, the growth is tremendous, and we expect the numbers to double from 2016 to 2020, from about $2 trillion to $4 trillion in the next 4 years. Again, we're all familiar with this. We know that's the market that we are going to all thrive in over the next generation. But it certainly brings in some other aspects that we need to focus on also. One of those is a strategic effort around returns management or reverse logistics. And if you look here at the first bullet there, right below the diagrams, 30% of the products that are purchased online are returned compared to 9% from a brick and mortar environment. So with 30%, you can imagine 30% of your product in the old style of returns would be thrown away, destroyed, marked down, and that is too large of a percentage of your product base to have a discount rate on your final sales. So the purpose of the compression that I was talking about earlier is to speed up sell-through rates, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have these returns. And the reasons for the returns that you can see here are 20% say it's damaged, so they return it. 22% say the product received didn't quite look the same as they thought it looked when they purchased it online. 23% say it was just the wrong item. And then there's this 35% that have other reasons. And I suspect that within this 35% is a very large percentage that is returning the product just because they can. We have created behavior with the online selling that it is perfectly fine to purchase as much as you need and you want to try on and simply return what you don't because it's easy. And that's okay. And at the bottom here you'll see 49% of the retailers are now having returns free. If you're in the 51%, you're likely going to be in the 49% very soon because people will not buy from you if you're not going to offer free returns. That's just a model that is not sustainable. People are simply going to go to one of your competitors that will offer that engagement that is more, just a better experience for them. So having a formal returns process is bigger now that it's gone from 9% to potentially 30%. So how do we do that? How do you implement a formal returns management program? Certainly it involves the collection and transportation of goods. That could be directly from the store, that could be directly from your DC. In the previous generations, I've seen them, I've managed them where the goods get returned to the store by the consumer. They sit in the back room for the week, then they get sent back to the DC. They sit on a pallet in the DC. They start to accumulate, and what are we going to do? What are we going to do with all these goods? And so there needs to be an effort to quickly capture those, put them in storage, as I just mentioned, but quickly then assess them. What is it? Is it damaged? Is it still good? Is it completely packaged like it was before? Once that's identified, what's wrong with the product, and especially with the e-environment, the e-retail environment, most of the product coming back is perfectly fine. And it's still packaged sometimes. So once we identify what needs to happen, then you can start to determine if I can repair it, can I repackage it, can I relabel it? And what we see today is most retailers do not want any of this activity occurring in their normal distribution center, which is a little counterintuitive also, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Because the DC is focused on this inbound receipt of product, store delivery, fulfillment, this is not something that they have put together as a strategic initiative, and they sometimes just don't want it in their DC. So it's often an outsourced service. But with that then, if it is outsourced, or even if it's insourced, certainly you want to then have the proper reporting against it so you can to create a better problem, create a better solution in the future. And then the idea there is ideally to identify how can you get it back into inventory as soon as possible. So by having it insourced, where you manage your own returns and you want to turn them quickly, the idea is to get it in, identify whether it needs to be repaired or relabeled or ticketed or disposed of, and quickly get it back into inventory within the season. And that's one of the hard points. If you don't get it back on the shelf within the next week or two, you've lost the season. It's obsolete, and now you're on the discount rack all over again. So imagine 30% of the product getting on a discount rack because you can't turn it quickly enough as it came back in. So that's one of the critical pieces here is the strategy of the return management program is to get it, gather it, and quickly get it back into the same season in which you've launched it. And that's a tough chore. Another piece, I'm jumping into different ideas here. Another area of that we're seeing, trend for the retailers is the reintroduction or the resurgence of RFID. And we've all heard about RFID for many years, and again, here there may be a number of retailers that are already using RFID within the stores, but we're seeing a significant resurgence and growth in this area that we did not see previously when RFID was launched over the last 15, 20 years where people were talking about it quite a bit. And also, in line, in proportion with the e-com sales from a global perspective, whereas moving from 2 trillion to 4 trillion, the RFID market is also growing and doubling in the same time. So from 2016 to 2020, it's moving from a little over 12.5 billion to 24.5 billion as a market size for RFID, right in line with the e-commerce growth. Now, I think there's a reason for that, and that is the omni-channel environment in which we live in. Without the RFID, it's difficult to truly optimize that inventory in all channels wherever the inventory is located. So with an RFID tag, you know that it's in the back room, you know that it's on the wrong shelf, and when a customer comes in looking for something and it's not on the shelf in the rack or location in which I'm expecting my size and color to be because it's slipped over here or it's still unpacked or it's in the returns bin, without knowing that quickly, then I will miss that sale. And those items, now, after one customer comes in, another customer comes in, and maybe they've never got back on the shelf in the right location, those products are now destined to the discount rack, the sale, the out-of-season product. So the only way to truly optimize it quickly and have it in the consumer's hands the moment he's looking for it is to be able to identify where it is at all times. Even from one store to another store, if you have a store where it is out of product, people will go online and say, well, we've got it at another store, and that's good. But with an RFID implementation, you're able to identify that much more quickly. You can contact the other store. You can have it delivered to the customer's house. You can have it brought over to the store if it's within a 5 or 10 minute drive. And the RFID enables this visibility across the inventory of existing store operations, much better than without it. The other discussion around RFID has always been around the cost. And today, the latest technology of passive tags are now down to about 5 cents. There's still a push, of course, as you can see on the slide, to get it down to 0.1%. And I'll touch on that here in a second also. Some of the uses for RFID, and this is kind of what launched it originally, was the idea of loss prevention in stores. But RFID never really took off significantly, with that being the return on investment focus. But if you go down a couple of the steps here to the other items, and if they were pulled together into like omni-channel inventory control, it would by far be the largest line on the chart. But they're broken down into different segments here. But the second one down, item level and on-floor replenishment from backstock, cycle counting in stores. Drop down a couple more and you've got in-store fulfillment. Those areas that's the greatest benefit and return on investment with RFID, is understanding the inventory levels so that you can control the omni-channel environment, the many sales channels that exist, yet have one common inventory. Now what's coming up with the RFID, the trends down here at the bottom, is the chipless tags. And they're looking into technology and developing it now where the RFID is woven within the fabric or built within the dye that is absorbed within the fabric. So it's no longer a tag, and it's no longer a 5 cent tag of all things, right? Now they're getting them down to 1/10% by blending it within the fabric to where you don't even notice that it's there, yet you're able to utilize it across your inventory for the store, the DC, or the pipeline. The next trend in supply chain, again, no different than many other industries, is certainly the idea of big data. Aside from the statistics here, I just go to the far one to the right there. The 75% of leaders cite that growth as the key source of value from analytics. So the purpose of analytics is really for the growth that they're seeing. It's not just a retroactive, here's what we did. They're using it to predict what is going to happen in the future. They're predicting consumer behavior. They're predicting the way that, in this case, the supply chain will move. An example that we use internally is to look at the way that your ERP is set up, using the common ones, which are an SAP or an Oracle, for example, ERP systems, and you have a plan, and then you have an activity that's occurred, and oftentimes companies don't go back into the plan and adjust it for what has been happening. And so let's say you've got let's just call it a 40-day lead time to market, and whenever the product gets to market, it's 42 days, and you say you failed because I was looking at a 40-day plan. Often the comparison is from the actual to what a transportation company provided. I can get it there in 40 days, and it got there in 42 days. But again, if you remember the charts, that's the end of the activity. It's way too late to really to manage a big difference. The question is, what does your ERP say with these time date stamps? Because that is what your whole organization is working off of, is that ERP plan. And so by pulling data out of the ERP and comparing it to operational data, we're able to correlate back the actual activity back to the ERP so that your plans for the next season or even the next week are updated quickly. So with the big data, what I'd recommend from a supply chain perspective is, and specifically in retail, is it's important to have someone on the staff who is really very talented and knowledgeable about pulling data in from various sources and putting them into the sophisticated business intelligence tools. We certainly use them ourselves, a company called Tableau, which many of you are probably familiar with. I would have someone on your staff. I've even hired one in my own department, and probably have a handful of them in other departments, just for the purposes of pulling in data, assessing it, and displaying that back to the customers, the retail customers, so they can understand what we're doing as a supply chain to help them to succeed. Okay, my last note here is on blockchain. How many people have heard of blockchain? Anyone? Not many? Yeah. What about Bitcoin? Anyone heard of Bitcoin? A few more? Okay. So I'm just going to bring this up because this is an early point, I guess, in the life cycle of blockchain. This is not a trend yet, but trust me, this will be a huge subject on everybody's plate in the next 10 years. So blockchain is the technology behind Bitcoin, if you're even familiar with Bitcoin. And what blockchain offers is the opportunity to have a more distributed, what they refer to as a distributed ledger, but it's a transaction that occurs. And today, where it's a centralized transaction ledger, it will become a distributed ledger. And I know this means absolutely nothing to anybody at this point yet. So that's the point. It is very complicated. But today, as a retailer, you have activities with your banks, with your outside advertising companies, with your supply chain partners, with marketing, if I didn't already say that, with your product suppliers. All these are different partnerships that you have. And the only validation when you have an exchange and a transaction of some sort, the central thing is, the central validation point is you, the retailer. It's all exist on your server, these activities. And those partners have very similar engagements with other retailers. There's no correlation between them other than they just happen to be shared. But it's all dependent on you centrally. On a distributed ledger environment, you may have a transaction with an outside party, but all other stakeholders, banks, regulatory entities, anyone else that's involved indirectly is now more involved directly. There's a validation process. So let me give you an example. So this is called a proof of work or a proof of stake. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But it's the protocol that goes through. And whenever one entity or one company wants to send money to another company for exchange of goods or services, it comes together as a block. It's a transaction set. When it moves through the chain to get accepted, the people who are involved, the banks, the regulatory entities, the other stakeholders, they all have an algorithm or a mathematical formula that says, as long as these criteria are met, let it go through. So it's a validation process. And it's already out there in the internet. And so when these two parties want to come together and say, I want to have a transaction, these nodes that are part of the blockchain, that web that I showed in the previous slide, if it'll go back there, these nodes all have a say in validating that transaction. If it's validated, and this is like a very quick validation based on protocol that is already established, then that block gets attached, as you continue down the route after the validation, it gets attached to the previous blocks that occurred. And in theory, you have one block that will go and attach to every block to the beginning of blockchain. And you think, well, what in the world does this have to do with supply chain and retail? Well, here's an example. So, and this was actually one that Nestle presented at a conference that I spoke to that I participated in a few months ago. So think about the products that Nestle uses and baby formula or anything else. They happen to have a particular product in it called palm oil, which is also used in many, many other things. It's one of the most widely distributed ingredients in a consumer product that's a consumable. Not only consumable, also makeup, hairspray, and anything else. This palm oil is in high demand. So there's an issue, though, that palm oil is harvested from a forest in the Sumatran forest in Indonesia, and it's completely obliterating not only the forest, but the animals. So the Sumatran orangutan is very close to extinction, moving from 60,000 to 6,000. Now, this story isn't about the orangutan, although I think it's important to be courteous to our fellow mates on the planet. But the reality is, if you as a consumer recognize that the product you were buying was using palm oil that was being harvested from poached lands that were destroying not only the environment, but also the life of other species. Or even another example, you could trace it back to some toxic environment or child labor or something like that. Would you as a consumer now feel that you're empowered to choose another product? With blockchain technology, you're going to be able to see that transparently all the way back to the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supplier of products, back to the core materials or the conflict minerals that are at concern at some countries. So that's where blockchain is going to play a big role. It's in the provenance and the identification of the early materials that are all eventually built up to create your final product. And consumers are going to want to know what is in that product, and is this a retailer that I want to buy product from? Are they responsible to my environment? Are they responsible to the health and welfare of my family? Okay. Outside of supply chain, it's going to be in banking, it's going to be in certainly just the regular retail exchange environment, any sort of transaction, the legal environment, smart contracts. So I just want to bring that up. It's a trend, but it's a new trend. But believe me, if you've heard of, let's say something like cloud computing, blockchain will be the new cloud computing. It will go across the entire industry, and everyone will participate. Okay, that's the last of my supply chain trends. And I'll be glad to talk about any of those, of course, as we're out in the hallway if anyone wants to hear anything more about them. Okay, thank you.